The town of Red Hollow was the kind of place where everyone knew everything about everyone, or at least they believed they did. It sat under a wide, unforgiving sky, dust clinging to boots and secrets clinging to hearts. Nothing unusual ever happened there, and when it did, the town made sure it didn't stay unusual for long. That was why when Thomas Hale stood up in the middle of the general store one quiet afternoon and said he was looking for a wife, the laughter came fast, loud, and merciless. Thomas wasn't a man people took seriously. He was tall but awkward, broad-shouldered but slightly hunched, as if the weight of years of quiet ridicule had shaped his posture. His clothes were always clean but worn, his hands rough from honest work, his face plain in a way that made people look past him rather than at him. He lived on the edge of town in a small, weathered house, kept to himself, and spoke only when necessary. To most, he was just that strange man, the one who never quite fit. So when he cleared his throat and said, "I'm looking for a wife," it was like he had handed the town a gift wrapped in absurdity. "A wife?" one man barked, slapping the counter as laughter erupted. "You?" another chimed in. "Boy, you can barely hold a conversation, and you think someone's going to marry you?" The room filled with chuckles and mocking glances. Even the shopkeeper shook his head with a smirk. But Thomas didn't laugh. He stood there, hands steady at his sides, eyes calm in a way that didn't match the chaos around him. "I'm serious," he said, his voice firm, cutting through the noise just enough to make a few people pause. That only made it worse. "Hear that? He's serious," someone called out, and the laughter doubled. "What are you offering, huh?" another man sneered. "You got money? Land? Charm? Because from where I'm standing, you ain't got much of anything." Thomas didn't respond immediately. He looked around the room, meeting eyes one by one, not with anger, but with something deeper, something steady, almost unshakable. "I have a home," he said quietly. "I have honest work, and I'd give respect, loyalty, a life where she'd never be treated like she doesn't matter." The laughter faltered for a moment, but only for a moment. "Respect?" someone scoffed. "You think that's enough?" "It ain't a fairy tale, Thomas," another added. "Women don't just line up for that." The words hit harder than they should have, but Thomas stood his ground. He had spent years being overlooked, dismissed, turned into the town's quiet joke. But this mattered to him. This wasn't a passing thought or a foolish whim. It was something he had carried for a long time, something he had finally decided to say out loud. "Maybe they don't line up," he said, "but I'm not asking for a line. I'm asking for one person who wants the same kind of life I do." More laughter, though thinner now, less certain. And then, from the far corner of the store, a voice spoke. "What kind of life is that?" The room shifted. Heads turned. The laughter died, not completely, but enough to let the question settle into the air like something heavier than mockery. She stepped forward slowly, her presence quiet but commanding in a way no one expected. Clara Whitmore wasn't someone who spoke often in crowded rooms, but when she did, people listened. Not because she demanded it, but because something in her voice made them. She wasn't the most beautiful woman in Red Hollow, not by the town's shallow standards, but there was a strength in her, a clarity in her eyes that made people uneasy if they tried to underestimate her. She had her own share of whispers trailing behind her, stories of a past she never explained, of choices she never defended. She stopped a few feet from Thomas, her gaze steady, unflinching. "You said you want a wife," she continued. "Not a servant, not a decoration, a wife. So I'll ask again, what kind of life are you offering?" The room was silent now, completely silent. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since he had spoken, something shifted in his expression. Not doubt, not fear, but recognition. "A quiet one," he said, "but not an empty one. A place where she's heard, where she matters, where she doesn't have to fight just to be respected." Clara tilted her head slightly, studying him. And what do you expect in return? The question hung sharp in the air. This wasn't mockery. This wasn't laughter. This was something else entirely. Something real. Thomas didn't hesitate. The same, he said. Respect. Honesty. Someone who chooses to stay, not because they have to, but because they want to. A murmur moved through the crowd, softer now, uncertain. This wasn't the spectacle they had expected. Clara took another step closer. And if she's not perfect, she asked, if she comes with a past, with mistakes, with things this town would never let her forget? A few people shifted uncomfortably. They knew that tone. They knew. That question wasn't just hypothetical. Thomas's answer came just as steady as before. Then she's human, he said, and she'd still deserve a life that isn't defined by what others think of her. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. It pressed against the walls, against the people, against the assumptions they had all carried so easily just minutes ago. Clara's eyes searched his face, looking for hesitation, for doubt, for the smallest crack in his words. She didn't find one. And then she asked the question, the one that would stay with that town long after the moment had passed. Then why, she said slowly, her voice clear enough to cut through every lingering whisper, would a man like you, who sees things this clearly, choose to ask for a wife in a room full of people who don't? No one laughed. No one moved. The entire town, for the first time in a long time, had nothing to say. Thomas held her gaze, the weight of her question settling into him, not as pressure, but as something that demanded truth. He took a breath, steady and unhurried. Because I thought, he said, that maybe there was one person here who was tired of being seen the same way I am. The words landed like thunder in a clear sky. Something shifted in the room, something subtle but undeniable. The laughter from earlier now felt misplaced, hollow, like a mistake no one wanted to acknowledge. Clara didn't look away. And what if there is? She asked quietly. Thomas's voice didn't waver. Then I'd ask her to walk out of this room with me, he said, not because I'm offering something grand, but because I mean every word I said. The tension in the room tightened, every eye moving between them, waiting, watching, holding its breath. Clara's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did, something deeper, something no one in that room had ever really seen before. And for a long moment, she said nothing at all. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, wrapping itself around every person in the room until even the sound of breathing felt too loud. Clara's gaze never left Thomas, as if she were weighing something far greater than his words, something buried beneath years of quiet judgment and unspoken truths. The town waited, not with mockery now, but with a restless curiosity they couldn't quite hide. Finally, Clara took a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling with a calm that seemed almost deliberate. Then let me ask you one more thing, she said, her voice softer now but no less steady. If I walked out with you, what would happen when this town starts talking again tomorrow? A faint ripple moved through the crowd, as if the question had brushed against their pride. Thomas didn't look at them. He didn't even acknowledge their presence. His eyes stayed on Clara, unwavering. They will talk, he said simply. They always do, but they won't be the ones living our life. The words settled into the air with a quiet finality. Clara studied him for another moment, searching for any sign of uncertainty, any hint that his resolve might falter under pressure. There was none. Just that same calm, grounded certainty that had been there from the start. Around them, people shifted uncomfortably. Some crossed their arms, others looked away, as if suddenly unsure of where to place their judgment. The spectacle they had been enjoying had turned into something else entirely, something that made them feel exposed. Clara glanced briefly around the room, her eyes passing over faces that had whispered about her for years, that had reduced her to stories and assumptions. Then she looked back at Thomas. You really don't care what they think? She asked. Thomas shook his head slightly. I used to, he admitted, but it never changed anything. It never made them kinder. It just made me smaller. I'm done living like that. That answer hit deeper than anything else he had said, because it wasn't just words, it was truth, raw and unpolished. Clara felt it, and for a brief second, something inside her shifted, something she had kept guarded for a long time. "And if I said yes?" she asked. A few people in the room inhaled sharply. The question wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to silence even the faintest whisper. Thomas didn't smile. He didn't move closer. He simply answered. "Then I'd walk out of here with you," he said, "and I wouldn't look back." Another pause, longer this time. He wasn't rushing her. He wasn't convincing her. He was giving her a choice, something she hadn't been offered in a long time. Clara lowered her gaze for just a moment, as if considering everything that had led her to this exact point. The years of being misunderstood, the quiet isolation, the way the town had decided who she was without ever asking. When she looked up again, there was something different in her expression. Not softness, not certainty, but a kind of clarity that only comes after a long internal battle. She stepped forward, just one step. But in that small movement, the entire room seemed to hold its breath again. "Then don't," she said quietly. Thomas frowned slightly, just enough to show he didn't fully understand. Clara's eyes met his, unwavering. "Don't look back," she repeated. And then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. For a second, no one moved. It was as if the town itself couldn't process what had just happened. Then slowly, all eyes turned to Thomas. This was the moment they expected him to hesitate, to second-guess, to falter under the weight of what he had just been offered. But Thomas didn't hesitate, not even for a second. He followed her. The sound of his boots against the wooden floor echoed louder than it should have, each step carrying a kind of quiet defiance. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't acknowledge the stares, the whispers that were beginning to stir again. He just walked. Clara reached the door first and pushed it open, the late afternoon light spilling into the store, cutting through the dim interior like a line drawn between two worlds. She stepped outside without stopping. Thomas crossed the threshold a heartbeat later, and just like that, they were gone. Behind them, the door swung slowly shut, the echo of it lingering longer than any laughter ever had. No one spoke, not immediately. The room that had been so full of noise just minutes ago now felt hollow, as if something important had slipped through their fingers before they even realized it mattered. "Did that just happen?" someone muttered under their breath. No one answered, because no one had an answer that made sense. Outside, the air felt different, cleaner, quieter. Clara walked a few steps away from the store before stopping, her back still turned to Thomas. He gave her space, not crowding her, not rushing to fill the silence. After a moment, she spoke. "You know they're going to make this into something it's not," she said. Thomas nodded. "They always do." She turned then, facing him fully for the first time without the presence of the town pressing in around them. "And you're still willing to stand beside me when they do?" she asked. Thomas met her gaze. "Yes." No hesitation, no conditions, just a simple, undeniable truth. Clara searched his face again, one last time, as if this was her final chance to find a reason to walk away. But instead of doubt, she found something she hadn't expected to see. Peace. Not the absence of struggle, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're willing to stand for. She exhaled slowly, a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "All right," she said. It was a small word, simple, but it carried more weight than anything else that had been said that day. Thomas didn't react with excitement or surprise. He simply nodded, as if he had been ready for this answer all along. "All right," he echoed. For a moment they just stood there, two people who had spent years on the edges of a world that never quite made room for them, now standing at the beginning of something neither of them had planned, but both had chosen. The town behind them would talk. It would twist the story, reshape it, try to fit it into something easier to understand. But for the first time, neither of them cared, because what they had done wasn't for the town, it was for themselves. And as they turned and began to walk down the quiet road together, side by side, there was no grand declaration, no dramatic gesture, just a shared understanding, a choice, a beginning. And back in Red Hollow, long after they had disappeared from sight, people would remember that moment, not the laughter, not the mockery, but the question that had silenced them all, and the answer that had walked right out the door with it.